You've done the things. The degree, the promotion, the recognition, the milestone that was supposed to finally settle the question of whether you're good enough. And for a moment, a brief, almost imperceptible moment, it did. And then the feeling came back. The quiet, persistent conviction that you don't actually belong here, that you've somehow fooled everyone, that the achievement was luck, or timing, or the failure of the people around you to see what you're certain is true about yourself. That any day now, someone is going to look closely enough to notice that you are not what your accomplishments suggest you are. The world has a name for this now: impostor syndrome. And the word has become so common that it's lost most of its meaning, reduced to a mild professional inconvenience that ambitious people mention almost as a humble brag. But underneath the term is something far older and far more revealing than the modern framing suggests. Something that a psychologist named Alfred Adler mapped almost a century ago, long before anyone had coined the phrase, and understood with a depth that the current conversation has almost entirely lost. Adler's insight was this: the feeling of being a fraud is not a distortion that happens to successful people despite their success. It is the engine that produced the success in the first place. The high achiever and the person secretly convinced of their own inadequacy are not two different people who happen to occupy the same body. They are the same phenomenon, viewed from two different angles. And until you understand the mechanism connecting them, you will keep trying to achieve your way out of a feeling that achievement was never capable of resolving. Alfred Adler was one of the three founding figures of modern depth psychology, alongside Freud and Jung, though he is the least famous of the three, and in some ways the most immediately useful. He broke with Freud early. He could not accept the idea that human behavior was driven primarily by repressed sexuality, and built his own school of thought around a different central force. Not sex, not even the unconscious in the Freudian sense, but something he considered more fundamental to the human experience: the feeling of inferiority, and the lifelong project of overcoming it. Adler noticed something in his patients and, more importantly, in himself. He had been a sickly child, physically weak, acutely aware of his own smallness in a world of stronger and more capable people. And he came to believe that this early experience, the experience of being small, dependent, and inadequate in the face of a large and demanding world, was not unique to him. It was universal. Every human being begins life as a small, helpless creature surrounded by giants who can do everything the child cannot. Every human being, in other words, begins in a state of inferiority so total that it structures the entire psyche that develops afterward. This is the foundation of Adler's entire system. The feeling of inferiority is not a pathology that afflicts some unfortunate people. It is the starting condition of being human. And the whole of a person's psychological life, Adler argued, can be understood as the ongoing attempt to move from this original position of felt inadequacy toward a position of competence, mastery, significance. He called this movement striving for superiority, though by superiority he did not mean dominance over others. He meant the overcoming of one's own smallness, the movement from a felt minus to a felt plus. The high achiever, in Adler's framework, is not someone who has escaped the feeling of inferiority. The high achiever is someone in whom this feeling was so acute and the drive to compensate for it so powerful that it organized an entire life around the pursuit of the competence that would finally disprove it. Which means the feeling of being a fraud is not a bug in the high achiever's psychology. It is the very thing the achievement was built to silence. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Adler drew a crucial distinction that the modern conversation has almost completely collapsed, and understanding it is the key to everything that follows. There is a difference between the feeling of inferiority and the inferiority complex. They are not the same thing, and the difference determines whether the feeling becomes the fuel for a meaningful life or the foundation of a lifelong sense of fraudulence. The feeling of inferiority is normal, and in Adler's view, useful. It is the recognition of a gap between where you are and where you could be, and that recognition is the source of all growth, all ambition, all the striving that moves a person from incompetence toward mastery. A person who felt no inferiority would have no reason to develop, to learn, to reach for anything beyond their current state. The feeling is the engine of becoming. The inferiority complex is something else. It is what happens when the feeling of inferiority stops being a spur to growth and becomes a fixed conviction about the self. When the gap between where you are and where you could be stops being experienced as a challenge to rise to and starts being experienced as permanent evidence of a fundamental inadequacy. The person with an inferiority complex does not feel inferior about specific things in specific moments. They feel inferior as a condition of their being, a settled fact about who they are that no external achievement can touch. And here is where Adler's analysis becomes genuinely disturbing in its precision. The inferiority complex and the drive toward high achievement are not opposites. They are frequently the same thing. The person who feels fundamentally, unshakably inadequate does not necessarily withdraw from the world. Very often, they do the opposite. They throw themselves into a relentless pursuit of the accomplishments that might finally prove the feeling wrong. They become the high achiever precisely because the inadequacy is so intolerable that only constant escalating evidence of competence can hold it at bay. But the evidence never holds it at bay for long, because the achievement is addressing a symptom, not the cause. The feeling of inadequacy does not come from an actual lack of accomplishment. The accomplishments prove that. It comes from a conviction about the self that exists independently of the evidence, and that reinterprets every achievement to preserve itself. The promotion was luck. The recognition was a mistake. The success was real, but you are still, underneath it, the inadequate person you have always secretly known yourself to be. This is the fraud feeling, and it is not irrational given its premise. It is the perfectly logical output of a psyche that has decided, at a level beneath conscious thought, that no amount of external success can change an internal verdict that was reached long ago. Adler used the word compensation to describe the way people attempt to overcome their felt inferiorities, and it is one of his most important and most double-edged concepts. Compensation is the psyche's response to a perceived weakness, the drive to make up for a deficiency by developing strength, often in the very area of the original weakness, sometimes in a completely different one. Compensation can be one of the most productive forces in human life. The sickly child who becomes an athlete, the person who stuttered as a child and becomes a spellbinding speaker, the individual who felt powerless and builds a life of genuine competence and contribution. Adler himself was the sickly child who became a physician and one of the most influential psychologists of his era. Much of what is best in human achievement is, in Adler's view, compensation, the transformation of a felt weakness into a real strength. But compensation has a shadow, and the shadow is where the fraud feeling lives. There is a difference between compensation that resolves the underlying inferiority and compensation that is driven by it without ever touching it. The healthy version builds real competence and, in doing so, actually addresses the original sense of inadequacy. The person becomes genuinely capable and knows it. The unhealthy version builds real competence, but never lets it register, because the achievement was never actually about competence. It was about silencing a feeling. And a feeling that exists independently of reality cannot be silenced by reality. This is the compensation trap, and it is the specific mechanism of the high-achieving fraud. The person is genuinely accomplished. The achievements are real. The competence is not imaginary. But the achievements were pursued in the service of a psychological need that they were structurally incapable of meeting. Each accomplishment was supposed to be the one that finally settled the question. And each accomplishment, upon arrival, revealed itself to be insufficient, because the question was never really about accomplishment. The bar rises the moment it is reached. The goal, upon achievement, immediately reveals a further goal that must now be attained before the person can finally feel they are enough. And there is always a further goal, because the feeling driving the whole enterprise was never going to be resolved by the next rung of the ladder. Adler saw that this could become a kind of prison, a person running faster and faster on a track that has no finish line, mistaking the absence of arrival for a personal failure, rather than recognizing it as a structural feature of the entire project. The high achiever who cannot rest, cannot enjoy what they've built, cannot shake the feeling of impending exposure, is not lacking one more achievement. They are trapped in a form of striving that was designed from the beginning to never conclude. There is a further layer to Adler's analysis that deepens the picture considerably. He understood that the feeling of inadequacy is almost never about an absolute standard. It is about comparison. The child feels inferior not in the abstract, but in relation to the adults and older children who can do what the child cannot. And this comparative structure never goes away. It follows the person into adulthood and organizes their entire experience of their own worth. The high achiever is often a person for whom comparison has become a permanent and inescapable mode of perceiving the world. Every room is instantly assessed. Every peer is measured. Every accomplishment is evaluated not on its own terms, but against the accomplishments of others, and specifically against the accomplishments of those who seem to be further ahead. This is a game that cannot be won, because there is always someone further ahead, and even in the rare moments of being the most accomplished person in a given room, the comparison simply relocates to a larger arena. The person who has beaten everyone in their field discovers a new field in which they are again a beginner. The comparison is not a response to reality. It is a lens through which all of reality is filtered. Adler also introduced an idea he called the fictional final goal, the image of an ideal self that a person constructs and orients their entire life toward. This ideal self is, in Adler's word, a fiction. Not because it is bad, but because it is an imagined perfection that does not and cannot exist. The problem arises when a person measures their actual self against this fictional ideal and experiences the inevitable gap as evidence of failure. The high achiever frequently carries a fictional final goal of extraordinary proportions, a vision of the person they must become that is so idealized, so complete, so free of the weaknesses and uncertainties of an actual human being that no real accomplishment could ever close the distance. They are not comparing themselves to other people in the end. They are comparing themselves to a perfect version of themselves that was never a real possibility. And against that standard, everyone is a fraud. Adler was, above all, a practical psychologist. He was not interested in analysis for its own sake. He wanted to know how a person could actually live better, and his framework points toward a set of shifts that are simple to state and difficult to make, but that address the fraud feeling at its root rather than at the level of its symptoms. The first shift is to recognize that the feeling of being a fraud is not information about your competence. This is the crucial and counterintuitive move. Every instinct tells you the feeling is a signal, that it is pointing at a real inadequacy that you need to fix through further achievement. Adler's framework reveals that the feeling is not a signal about the present. It is a residue of the past, the persistence of an old verdict about the self that was reached in childhood, and that has been reinterpreting all evidence to preserve itself ever since. The feeling is real. What it claims to be evidence of is not. Learning to hold that distinction, to feel the fraudulence fully while recognizing that it is not actually reporting on your competence, is the beginning of loosening its grip. The second shift is from striving for superiority to what Adler called social interest. This is perhaps his most important and most overlooked idea. Adler came to believe that the healthiest human beings are not those who successfully overcome their inferiority through personal achievement, but those who redirect the energy of their striving away from the self and toward contribution, toward being useful, toward connection, toward the good of the community they belong to. The reason this matters for the fraud feeling is profound. The person striving for superiority is trapped in a perpetual self-assessment, always measuring, always comparing, always asking whether they are enough. The person animated by social interest is asking a different question entirely. Not am I good enough, but what is needed here and can I help? And this question, unlike the first, has actual answers. You can contribute, you can be useful, you can connect. And in doing so, the exhausting question of your own adequacy quietly loses its central position because your attention is no longer fixed on yourself. The third shift is to examine the fictional final goal directly. Most high achievers have never consciously articulated the impossible standard they are measuring themselves against. It runs beneath awareness, exerting its pressure without ever being examined. Bringing it into the light, actually asking yourself what the person you're trying to become would have to accomplish before you would finally feel you were enough, often reveals the standard to be not just unreachable, but absurd. A version of yourself with no weaknesses, no uncertainty, no limits, admired by everyone, having achieved everything, permanently beyond the reach of any doubt. Stated plainly, the standard reveals itself as a fiction. And a fiction, once seen clearly as a fiction, loses much of its power to indict you for failing to meet it. The fourth shift is toward what Adler called the courage to be imperfect. This phrase, which his followers made central to the Adlerian tradition, captures the entire therapeutic movement his work points toward. The fraud feeling depends on the belief that you are supposed to be flawless, that your inadequacies are shameful evidence of your unworthiness, that being seen in your limitations would be a catastrophe. The courage to be imperfect is the willingness to be a limited, flawed, still developing human being, and to allow yourself to be seen as one without experiencing that as a failure. It is the recognition that everyone around you, including the people you compare yourself to and find yourself wanting against, is also a limited, flawed, still developing human being performing a competence they do not fully feel. The fraud feeling isolates you inside the conviction that you are uniquely inadequate behind a convincing performance. The courage to be imperfect returns you to the human community, where everyone is improvising and no one has arrived. Adler's great insight, beneath all the specific concepts, was that the human being is not primarily driven by the past, but pulled by the future, by the image of who we are trying to become. This is a hopeful idea, but it carries a warning inside it, because the image we are pulled toward determines the shape of the entire life. And if that image is a fictional perfection against which every real accomplishment will be measured and found wanting, then the life organized around reaching it will be a life of perpetual, structural fraudulence, no matter how much is actually achieved. The high achiever who secretly feels like a fraud is not suffering from a lack of achievement. They are suffering from the discovery that achievement was never going to deliver what they were using it to pursue. The feeling of being enough was never located at the top of the ladder. It was never going to be granted by the next accomplishment or the one after that. It was a different kind of thing entirely. Not an achievement to be earned, but a relationship to yourself to be developed. The relationship of someone who can hold their own inadequacy without being destroyed by it, who can contribute without needing the contribution to prove their worth, who can be imperfect, visibly and without apology, and still move through the world with the quiet steadiness of a person who has stopped waiting for permission to exist. You are not a fraud. You are a person who was taught, early and thoroughly, that your worth was conditional on a competence you would have to keep proving forever. And you have been proving it, brilliantly and exhaustingly, ever since. For an audience that was never going to render the verdict you were waiting for, against a standard that was never real, in pursuit of a feeling that was never going to arrive from that direction. The way out is not one more achievement. It is the slow, deliberate work of building a self that no longer requires the achievements to prove it deserves to be here. That self is available. It has always been available. It has simply been waiting, patiently, on the other side of the striving, for you to stop running long enough to notice it was there all along.